Now, one of the things that we hear from many of our guests as well is that they really enjoy every one of our thought leaders, speakers. But oftentimes they're somewhat challenged because they really want to know how to do it in the real world of work. And so the executive panel is an opportunity for us to have a discussion whereby you get to almost eavesdrop in on communication between senior leaders within organizations. And so joining us here today, we have Barb Mason, the Group Head and Chief Human Resources Officer of Scotiabank. Bill McFarland, the CEO, oh, there we go, she's got some fans, this is good. Bill McFarland is the CEO and Chief Inclusion Officer of PwC Canada. Bill needs to get some fans apparently. There we go. We also have Melanie Dunn, and she is the Global President and CEO, Cossette. Now it's a competition, go. And Caroline Riseboro, and Caroline is the President and CEO of Plan International Canada. Please join me now in welcoming all of them to our stage. Welcome. Barbara, join us here if you would. Bill, Melanie, and Caroline. And we get to make the hurdle into these directors' chairs. And so welcome, thank you so much for joining us as well. I have to admit and tell you a little bit about these people. I had lovely long bios of each of them to read to you, and they were backstage and they said, "Are you really gonna read all of that?" And I said, "Yeah, that's what we promised we'd do." They said, "Can we just have a conversation instead and skip the bios?" So there, by title alone, you're here and welcome. We're glad you could be with us. And so my first question for all of you, and maybe Barb, if we could start with you. 2018 International Women's Day campaign theme was that of #PressForProgress. Why is today so important, and why are days like today still necessary?
You know, I think that what's most important is that they continue to give us forums to have great conversation. I think this year, I can only speak for the one that we held at the bank. It was global in nature. We had thousands of employees participating around the world. We had men and women. We talked very transparently about the things that are working and the things that are not working, what we need to do more of. And so I think they're always wonderful reminders, but also forums where I see the conversation getting better and better, and about the really meaty issues that we need to change in the company and around the world. So I think that they're great reminders for us, and to make sure we continue to focus on the things that are most important for us to deal with at that time.
Thank you, Barb. Bill, your thoughts?
Maybe if I could just add to that, I think we haven't made the progress that we need to make today. So it's good to have a reminder. It's good to have it out there. I know at PwC, we had a great conversation with some outside speakers. We had a lot of banking and financial institution executives there. And for me, that was about sharing best practices, thinking about new ideas, what are the lessons learned that some of the other organizations have had. So what are the nuggets of gold that we could take away as an organization so that we could even do better? I think the other piece was getting our young people involved, which you talked about, which is important to have them involved in the dialogue so that we're actually in a different place a few years, a decade, forward, which is really, really important. So when I think about it, it's also a reminder to say this day is important, this day is useful and helpful, but it's actually the behaviors that we change every day that are going to make the difference.
Thank you, Bill. Melanie?
Yes, why is it important? Of course, I think we need to keep the conversation going, and that with everyone, not just women. So I'm glad to see that there's some men in the room here today. Not that many, but my team just joined, so there's 12 of them now, so I think 2 more. But there's another thing, about the panel that's important, and I think there will be panels for years and years, because I don't feel like diversity is necessarily a goal or something we need to address or fix. It's probably now some kind of an organic notion, meaning that, the challenges we were facing 50 years ago, let's say, where women were just trying to have, a spot in the workplace, were very different than the one we're facing right now. So where it's about diversity, but it's also about, gender, and there's different other notions that are added to diversity, which makes me think that in 50 years from now, there will be new challenges to address. So it's kind of a notion that's going to be ongoing that we need to embrace and include in our business plan somehow. I was reading an article very recently that hinted me of what's coming from a diversity standpoint. It was about AI and robots, and the question was, will we need to include robots into our diversity notions moving forward? Meaning that they'll be in a workplace, right? So probably we won't go there, but it makes me think that it's going to evolve with humankind. So,
Caroline.
Well, I would say that it's so important to continue to focus on these key moments like International Women's Day, because the reality is that oftentimes as Canadians, we can sit back and think that we're making tremendous progress. We have a Prime Minister who declares himself a feminist. We have the first gender-based or gender-balanced cabinet. And we see corporate Canada making huge commitments to gender equality, but I think we have to sit back and realize what is happening in the global context. And obviously that's what preoccupies myself and Plan International every day. I mean, the reality is we still have 130 million girls around the world who never get to step into a classroom simply because they're girls. We have pregnancy as one of the leading causes of death, even though we know the challenges that we need to overcome. And so what I'd say is that we still have a lot of work to do. And in fact, even to achieve gender equality here in Canada and around the world, going at the pace that we're going, it's going to take over 100 years. So it's not just good enough to have equality in Canada. We need to see it more widespread. And so I think that's why we have to keep up the good fight on International Women's Day.
Thank you. So today, most of the questions will be to you individually, but I do have one more question for all of you. And we are at the Art of Leadership for Women, and we need to ensure that women are represented throughout organizations. But as a gay man, it's not lost on me that we seem to be missing from this panel today other forms of diversity. So can you just each talk to me a little bit about how are you ensuring that diversity and inclusion are infused and integrated into your organizations? So maybe we'll just do the reverse order and then we'll break things up a bit. Caroline, would you start?
Sure. I mean, I think at Plan, we have a commitment to equality in all of the work that we do and diversity in all of the work that we do. We are literally fighting for some of the most marginalized groups, both here in Canada and around the world. So I would say that it really starts not only at the level of leadership, but making sure that the mandate is that of every single person within the organization. And, if I can maybe just take a moment to point out the obvious, we have a panel of all white individuals here. These are some of the things that we have to look at and make sure that we include diverse voices in every single opportunity that we have.
Yes, we try to do as much as possible too, and we have different committees and programs globally and locally that translate into local programs and plans, such as Montreal and Toronto now have gender neutral washrooms, right? But we also have, some foundational other, projects, such we have a, let's say, the salary equity policy, we have a code of conduct, an harassment policy. But what I'm the most proud of is that we're starting some formal training programs so people are more educated on, what's diversity and what are the issues we're facing. And some are very insidious, so we don't see them. They're not that bold. We were talking about unconscious bias, right? Double standards. So we're trying to educate our people more and more. But the other thing that I don't hear that often is it's all of the economical benefits of diversity, right? And there's a lot of studies and there's a lot of research that says, for instance, that mixed gender boards are making better decisions, are more, I would say, stronger on risk audit. They're more likely to grow. The company are more likely to grow. And the business case for diversity is not that much leverage, and it really talks to me as a businesswoman.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And when I came in and took over as the CEO and Chief Diversity Officer of PwC 7 years ago, we had a diversity program. And of course, we want to go from programs into actions and behaviors. But I changed it at the time to say, I want inclusiveness. And the reason for inclusiveness was, yes, diversity, male-female is probably our biggest issue, but it is actually saying to everyone in the organization, you're going to have the opportunity, an equal opportunity to actually develop, succeed, and grow to your absolute full potential. So that'd be kind of point number one from my perspective that I think is really important. And I think that broader inclusiveness actually resonates with people better. Second of all, I think part of this is about when you talk about business plans and how to integrate it, you got to lead from the top. And it was interesting for me, I didn't become the Chief Diversity Officer day one when I became the CEO of PwC, and I was kind of resisting it a little bit. And then as I got along in my term, I kind of said, well, actually, we need some symbols. We need some things that people can really look at and say, no, they're serious about this ultimately at the end of the day. And that was one of the reasons I expanded my title to be CEO and Chief Diversity Officer. So that was important from our perspective. It's also important to put goals in your plan. And I'm a big believer in aspirational goals, because if you look at it today, we're not where we need to be in these areas. So how do we get better? We set some stretch goals. We might not get all the way there. That'll be okay. But we'll at least start to think differently. And by setting some aspirational goals for the organization, and one of ours was 50-50 women partners in PwC by 2020, that started to change the conversation, because we knew we weren't going to get there if we kept doing the same things we've done in the past. And so for me, it's a few little things like that. And you talked about unconscious bias, and I think the education and the training that's required under that is really, really important for organizations. I've learned a lot by taking unconscious bias training. We all have biases. We all grew up in certain environments and with certain things that we thought were norms. And we have to change our thinking. We have to look at the world differently. We have to be aware of that so that we don't continue what's happened in the past. And we spend a lot of time and energy with a lot of our leaders in giving them unconscious bias training, and I think it's really starting to bear some fruit.
Thank you, Bill.
So I would say at Scotiabank, we have close to 90,000 employees around the world. We're operating in over 50 countries. More than 50% of our employees, their first language is Spanish. We have different cultures, different religions, different languages, different genders, different sexual orientations. So the natural diversity of our employee base and our customer base around the world is enormous. And so for us, it's whether we're in our accountability to employees is to create an environment where they can bring their best selves to work. Our employees to customers is to make sure that we treat them appropriately for their needs. And for our shareholders, we have to deliver great value. And so we've really understood that if we're not enabling our employees to bring their best selves to work, and if we're not fielding the best teams to deliver for customers, to deliver for shareholders, to be great leaders for our employees, if we somehow have conscious or unconscious biases that are preventing us from doing that, then by that nature, we're not going to service our customers as well as we can. We're not going to deliver for our shareholders as well as we can, and we're not going to lead our employees the way that they want to be leaded. And so we very much have a focus now on exactly that. It's an inclusive environment for everybody, and it doesn't matter kind of what you come in, the package that you come in, for any of those aspects of you, but what you really have to do is to be a great leader, deliver for customers, and at the end of the day, deliver for our shareholders. And so that is that business philosophy, you might say, at the end of the day, but really and truly it's about creating an environment where people really want to feel that they can do their very best, and if they are performing at the very best, they will succeed in many ways, not just monetarily, but in terms of how they feel being part of a community, being with friends, being with customers, all of those types of things. And so what we've really recognized too is that we can't drive this from the center. I would say historically a lot of companies have driven it from HR, and we really see it as a management accountability. Our CEO was in a country a few months ago in our Latin American footprint for a business meeting on profit plan, and the first thing he said around the table is, where are all the women? That was not what the CEO of that country was expecting as the first question. So it's a recognition that all of us are thinking about, are we fielding the best teams, or are you fielding teams that you feel most comfortable with? And that's an ongoing dialogue, no matter, as I say, kind of what package you come in as a person.
Wow. So, I mean, inclusion is so critical because a lot of people don't even realize that exclusion is a form of bullying. And so to not include someone, critical challenge. We do have some recent television phenomenal programs that are going on. Most people probably know that the TV show Mad Men is named actually after Madison Avenue. However, Mad Men, the legacy in the advertising industry, never mind even Mad Men, what about age discrimination as well? Melanie, what's happening in your industry?
Yeah. So, that TV show. Who saw Mad Men here? Just raise your hand, yeah. Unfortunately, too many people. And it stands for Madison, but probably put Mad. I think there's still something remaining of these days in our industry. So some of the behaviors portrayed in such a show. And I need to be careful, my team is here, it's not you guys, it's just, that the industry as a whole has some kind of a legacy. And what really surprised me when I didn't saw the whole show, a few episodes, but it happens in days where women were fighting for something that we don't have to fight for today, right? So, and it was as simple as having a spot on the workplace. And we're lucky enough that, they've been successful somehow, although there's still work to do. But the next generation, which is mine and yours, is the one that's seizing opportunity and built, on these battles. And we're finally accessing the C-suites, fortunately. But our own challenge, I think, is to work on these remaining of the whole days where I think that the expected behaviors of leaders today are sometimes a bit stereotyped. Meaning that, what is expected from a leader is somehow assertiveness and, aggressiveness, where as a woman, and it works for men also, but the new generation of leadership, I think, has other assets that are very modern, such as vulnerability, sensitivity, and empathy. But these are not necessarily celebrated yet, especially in my industry, and I think that there's work to do, which is a bit of trying to be in a position with the Madman period. But this being said, we're making tons of progress, especially at Cossette. But yeah, there's some kind of a legacy there.
And I mean, considering that advertising impacts every one of us, and especially those of you that are following Malala may have seen her on David Letterman's My Next Guest Needs No Introduction. They also had an episode with President Barack Obama, past president, and he was talking about how much we're influenced based on the Google sites that we go to, and so advertising dramatically impacts every one of us in very unique ways. Yeah. So, sorry, a comment to make?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, and as an advertiser, I feel somehow a responsibility over it. We are representing some of the most important and most loved brands, right, in Canada. And between all of them, they're spending millions, if not billions of dollars in the media space. That means that we're putting on air and online content that's supposed to reflect who we are as a society, right? And if you want to achieve that, you need to make sure that the creative behind this content are in fact and indeed diversified and open, to these issues. So it's almost like a responsibility that we have as an industry to be aware of these issues and make sure that through our work we are having an impact, a positive impact.
Beautiful. So Bill, I'm just the moderator, but you're the only man on the panel here today at the Art of Leadership for Women. So why do we need men, in your opinion, to champion inclusion of women?
Well, I think it would start from the perspective that we're not where we want to be today. And today, when you look at corporate Canada, you look at boards of directors, you look at the senior C-suite across much of the country, we don't have the representation that we want. And it's not broad. So therefore, if the men aren't involved in that conversation, and if they don't believe in that it's going to create better business that you talked about, more opportunities for our people, then nothing's going to change. We're not going to get past this status quo. So it's important for us to be role models, to talk about it, to explain to people why it is not only the right thing to do. And it's interesting, I think we all believe it's the right thing to do, but nobody's talked about that really yet today. But it's also good for business. I think of it and I step back and say, I used to be part of an executive team at PwC before I became CEO that had a 3-person executive, which was, I guess I can say it, 3 white guys from Toronto that were leading the firm. And I expanded that to be 6 people. I've got, an Asian on it, a French Canadian, I got 2 women, and a whole diverse group. Well, what happens there is we have way different conversations today within that team than we ever had before. There are different perspectives, different experiences that are being brought to bear, and things that I would never come up with based on where my experience is. And so we come up with way better business decisions, and our clients are also expecting that, which is really, really interesting for us. I was just this morning, major financial institution globally has decided they've set a goal for 40% of women in senior leadership positions, which is, great and a significant change for this organization. They've come to their suppliers, we happen to be their auditor, and said, and we want 40% of the senior women involved in this account around the world to also be women. And by the way, if you don't get there, we're going to penalize you on your fee, and if you get there, we'll give you a premium. And I thought, wow, now there is really innovative change, new ideas, new thinking that really changes the whole conversation. So I think we as men were also fortunate enough that somebody mentored, sponsored, coached me, and helped me navigate through my career. I owe it to other people, including women and other people, to mentor, coach, sponsor them so that they get the opportunities to effectively bring them their best selves and to meet their full potential within the firm.
Thank you. So Caroline, just building on that as well, as we know, almost all corporations have gender equality and inclusion policies. We have evidence to demonstrate the positive impact, as Bill mentioned, of having women on boards and at the C-suite level, the benefit that has on the organization. So why are we still struggling to see women reach the board and the C-suite levels? Why are there still barriers to women in leadership?
You know, I think it's an interesting time because, you know, whether it's government, whether it's corporations, we see significant commitments being made to gender equality. And oftentimes, we're starting with, you know, these public commitments. We're starting with also, you know, policies. But what we've been finding at Plan is we have a number of corporations in Canada and around the world and governments around the world that come to us and say, okay, we've put the policies in place, we've put the targets in place, but we're still not seeing the progress that we're hoping to see, or it's taking that much longer. Can you come in and help us? And the reason that Plan International comes in and does that work is because we actually work in 73 countries around the world at all levels, whether it's the community level, the family level, at the government level, the duty bearer level, to ensure that we're changing the way men and women and families interact in order to promote gender equality. And I think what we're missing right now is, it's kind of called unconscious bias, but I would say it actually goes a step further. And it's really that we have to start to address the social norms that we have here. So, you know, it was, how many know that it was Equal Pay Day on April 10th? Okay, well, it's Equal Pay Day on April 10th every year, and you know why? It's because Equal Pay, or April 10th is 3.5 months into the year, and it takes women 3.5 months longer to earn what men would earn in a year in Canada and around the world. And so the reason that's so important is we did a survey, and what we found is that 41% of Canadian women believe that they are doing the same amount of work or the same type of work as their male counterparts, but being paid less. And I think what was even more fascinating about the study that we did at Plan was that 50% of Canadian women said that their behavior was being held to a different standard than their male colleague. And this is, I think, what you were talking about, Melanie. So behaviors, let's say being aggressive by a woman, wouldn't be accepted. They would be called strident, but then a man would be considered proactive. And so until we start to address those concepts of behavior, those concepts of gender norms, and start to realize what's not equal and where do we need to move, it's going to be very hard for the policies alone to do that. And so I think what we oftentimes do at Plan International here in Canada and around the world is we unearth those gender norms that are harmful, and we try and push against them. And I was telling you, Bill, this isn't just good for women and girls. This is good for men and boys too. And I was in Ottawa about a year ago facilitating a discussion with youth there, and Sophie Gregoire-Trudeau is one of our global ambassadors. She was with me. And we went around the circle, and girls and boys were talking about their experience. And, you know, the girls, it was fairly, you know, the usual things that we hear. But what was surprising was we came to this 15-year-old boy, and he said, you know, my father died when I was young. I'm not your typical macho sort of jock. I am more sensitive, I'm more quiet, and because of that, I've been bullied my entire life, and I've considered killing myself. And so this is why we need to change gender norms, not just for girls, but it's also good for men and boys too.
Yeah. I just wanted to add to that, Caroline. So, we had a conversation the other day with about 200 people in our finance treasury area, and I was asked to speak at it. And one of the things that I talked about was work-life balance. Because I'm the person that always gets asked about work-life balance, and my CEO doesn't. And that's not, because work-life balance today is not a woman's issue. Work-life balance is an issue for everybody. And when women keep asking women about work-life balance, we're perpetuating a stereotype, because today there's two-income families, there's gay partners that have ailing parents, there's myself that had one point had children, now I have a mom with Alzheimer's, there's people who have partners that have mental health issues, there's all sorts of things, people involved in nonprofit parts of their lives, there's all sorts of things that cause our work-life balance to be sometimes in balance and out of balance. But if we continue to stereotype that fact, there's stay-at-home dads now. To be a stay-at-home dad in the workplace, is there a stereotype on that? Man, there's a huge one. And so the more that we can say that everybody can do whatever they want, and that's okay, and the fact that in the workplace, if that lack of balance comes from different reasons, let's not keep perpetuating the stereotype that A, it's children, and B, it's women. There's a whole bunch of stuff that causes stress in our lives today, and that we, as employers or friends or teammates or whatever we are, we got to help each other with that, as opposed to compartmentalizing it and saying it's one group's issue and not another. So it's a huge, I believe the social norms, it's huge.
We'll go to Bill, and then it looks like Melanie has something to say as well. So Bill, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Melanie.
Okay, and so when I think of the stereotyping you talked about and the unconscious bias training that we've given to people, and I think of what I've learned over the last several years, and there's some things that really jump out at me. I think of when I've had new opportunities to give new roles to people, that women are sometimes more hesitant to come forward, but I've got a whole stream of guys that think they're competent to do the job. And I've had to go out and tap some people on the shoulder and say, you know what? You'd be a great candidate for this job. You have the competency, you have the proven ability, and you'd be a phenomenal leader. And so sometimes us as men have to go out there and kind of push that a little bit, and I think that's important. I also was recently at a board. I'm the chair of a board. I won't give you the name right now, and we were selecting a new CEO, and we had a conversation at the board level, and this has a number of Canadian CEOs at it, and we had two candidates, a woman and a man, for this particular position, and the questioning started to come up at the board level. And we had the resumes for both, etc. And it was very different questioning for the man versus the woman. It was assumed that the man, because it was on his resume, was actually competent in all of those areas. But when we started, then went to the woman, it was, well, are you sure she can do that? And how has she proven that? And, etc. So again, some of those unconscious biases that are actually out there. And I stopped the meeting and I did a call out on it. And so I think we also have to get more comfortable in saying when we know something isn't quite right, we won't be perfect all the time, but let's stop. Let's have the call out. And when I think of it even in the PwC environment, it's often people thinking, well, this is the way you do business development. It's kind of the Me Too concept, and you got to be able to golf, you got to be able to go to the sports arena, you got to watch a game, you got to do that stuff. Now, I love all of that stuff. But that doesn't mean that's the only way to do business development, and there are lots of different roads that lead to the same destination, and so we have to let people actually do it their way, which actually, surprisingly, sometimes might even be more effective than our way, is the way that I would put it. And it actually might allow us as a business to fish in different ponds or pools that we've never been fishing in before. So again, there's this whole unconscious bias element is really important to start talking about these things and actually call them out and have those conversations.
Melanie, you wanted to add, please.
Yeah, and just to build on your point, I think it's a very fair point you're making where, you know, we act on double standards, for instance, but do we really embrace the new leadership styles, right? Instead of, and I have that mixed relationship with, you know, women leadership programs where we ask them to be braver and to show more courage and be more aggressive while, you know, maybe we don't need to change them. Maybe we just need to adapt to their new leadership styles. And to have them change is almost like defeating the purpose of diversity, right? So that's something that, you know, I'm looking into it more. On work-life balance, I would like to add something because it's a very important point. This being said, I think that many companies are lacking a bit authenticity over it, meaning that there's plenty of programs offered, flexible hours, you know, daycare, on-site, everything. But when you look at the C-suites, they're not role model, right? So they work night and day, and they stay late at night in the weekends, not, you know, using these flexible hours programs. And we need to act as role model and tell them that's what we expect from you. And look at me, I'm using these programs, I'm acting accordingly, and I'm the leader. So it's kind of a way to make them, you know, embrace these. I have 2 sons, 12 and 13, 2 stepdaughters, 2 sons. I'm traveling. So yes, if on Thursday at 4 I'm done with work, I'm going to go home, right? That's okay.
And I totally agree with that. And I think that, you know, as we enable employees more with digital and technology, and it's not about programs and policies anymore. It's about, you know, saying, okay, we have a flexible work or we don't. You can have work from home. It's more about you do the work when you can. I heard an interesting executive from Europe say that you should be able to work whenever you can and wherever you can, as long as you do not impact the productivity of another employee. And I thought, I like the sound of that, because I have a responsibility to my teammates to make sure that I'm delivering when they need to, but where I do that and when I do that, there needs to be a lot more flexibility, and technology is going to be a huge enabler of that. Huge.
So I have 2 challenges for you. Number 1, how many of you would be willing to eliminate your first name from your resume and simply put the first letter of your first name? It would be interesting how many corporations would be willing to mandate that all resumes come in only have B. Williams, B. Mason, and that's it. And we can't make that judgment of gender right at the application process, right from the beginning. It is interesting as well. I think one of the European countries that we're following is France, who has made it a law that you are not able to email staff after hours, knowing that staff will receive that email and want to reply. However, it's at a staff level, not at a leadership level. And so what's the impact a policy like that will have on people that choose to pursue? And I was blessed to have TheArtOF as my supporter when my father was passing. 3 months in a row, they gave me 10 days to travel to British Columbia to be with him and support him as he was moving on. So these are some incredible things that we have the opportunity to begin to consider about today and make some commitments and deliver today.
Can
Melanie,
I make a comment on that one?
Please, Bill.
The email one's an interesting one, and we've had lots of debates around that within our organization, et cetera. And maybe I'll take a bit of a contrarian view to what you're talking about. I think the key thing is that if I send out an email on the weekend, the people that I'm sending it to know that I don't need them to respond to it, and they don't have to deal with it until Monday morning. Because actually, when I think of my work-life flexibility, maybe for me personally, it works that I want to clear my plate on a whole bunch of stuff on Sunday morning. And so we have to be respectful to the other person's agenda, but also allow some flexibility for some of the leaders to actually have the ability to work in the way that they think is most useful. So again, to me, it's more about them knowing that I don't want a response, but they know my work style is I do stuff on Sunday morning.
And Bill, I'm okay with that so long as we would have Outlook and Google Mail and all these other systems allow us to have a sent at time and a deliver at time. So if I could compose an email on Saturday or Sunday at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock at night, but it will not be sent until 9 a.m. Monday morning, I'm good with that. It's an interesting challenge. It's a really interesting challenge. Melanie, I'm going to throw back to you here now. What impact does a lack of diversity have in the communications industry, in your business world itself?
Yeah, well, I think I mentioned earlier that, we almost have some kind of a responsibility in making sure that, the content we're producing as advertisers reflects the real society, or at least what we hope for it, right? And to do that, we need to have creative profiles that are indeed reflecting the reality of today's world, right? So we need to have more diverse teams that are, able to crack briefs that are specific to some clusters, but also to the population in general. But think of, everything that's happening on your TV, on your mobile. That's your surrounding environment, and it's deeply influenced by the content that's in there. So that's somehow a responsibility that we carry as advertisers, but also, all of the digital platforms are carrying some kind of a responsibility over it. And there's been a lot of talks recently on, on Facebook and what happened with the elections. And that's a single example of how powerful the media and advertising landscape is, and sometimes it's frightening. And I hope that, most of the leaders in these organizations will be responsible over the power that they are, they have in their hand.
Mm-hmm. Powerful, powerful. Bill, you mentioned that one of your partners, if you will, vendors, customers, has pushed for 40-60, but you also mentioned that you have 50-50 gender parity goals. Is that a quota?
It's definitely not a quota. In fact, one of the biggest mistakes I ever made, I used the word quota about 10 years ago, and I had a broad audience, and I had about 20 women come up to me afterwards, and they didn't strangle me, but they probably came pretty close to that. And certainly there is a big difference between quota versus actually earning something, and I think it's really important for women to be given the role, given the responsibility, because they're the best person for that role. So for us, when we set out the 50-50 new partners in 2020 for PwC, it was an aspirational goal. And quite honestly, if we get to 53% or 47%, I'm not really that concerned, because when we set it, we were at kind of 20 to 25% for women partners, and it really was to kind of set a target that would then change the conversation. That was really the big thing from my perspective, and from everyone that I certainly deal with. It's about us giving people opportunities. It's about us really changing our behaviors. That has to then get into talent management, into succession planning, and do we have diversity amongst the various roles down the chain, and how are we giving people the right experiences in order to expand and grow and develop. And certainly, I believe a key thing is sponsorship. So I actually, probably 7 or 8 years ago, I was at one of the Catalyst sessions, and they talked a lot about sponsorship, and it got me to thinking about sponsorship in a whole different way. I think I probably made the mistake at that stage that it was more mentorship versus sponsorship. And I think a mentorship being coaching, helping people, et cetera, giving them advice. Sponsorship is a much more proactive role, and we have all our senior leaders within PwC that actually sponsor women, and that's really about making sure they get the experiences, that we actually put our butts on the line, if that's the way I could put it, to make sure they get opportunities and roles that will help them expand and develop. But they get those because they've earned them, and they're the right people for the jobs.
Can I say something? So for context, backstage, Bill told us, don't be afraid to put something controversial out there. So I'm warning you right now. Part of me struggles with this as a woman who deals with this a lot, because I think that at the end of the day, we still keep putting numbers out there, right? We have the 30% club, we have these major goals that many corporations are putting out there. And then we also have this notion of sponsorship, and it's still really sort of oftentimes traditional folks in power saying, okay, I'm going to help you now move ahead. But I think we need to go a step further and say, actually, you know what? Part of it is that we have to address this notion of power, because even the whole concept of sponsorship is you have someone in a position of power helping a woman. And it's more, we have to do more than that. We actually have to say, you know what? Women deserve to be around the table. just for the fact that they can bring a different perspective, they can represent half of the world. We actually need them empowered because they are powerful themselves. And so part of me wants to actually move away from some of these conversations about just these numbers and quotas, because they still seem, again, the power imbalance, it still permeates some of that language. So I don't know what the right answer is, but I do feel that to some degree, it's still really saying that those in power have to help the others. And we actually just have to say, no, there's power among both those groups. And hence, everyone deserves to be around the table.
I'm never controversial. I think the difference in the way that I would look at it, I understand your point of view, would be that there are a lot of men that are being sponsored today, and it's really about leveling the playing field from my perspective, so that we help our whole talent pool really achieve the best success.
And I'll throw something in there too. I guess there's the whole word of power is also a scary word too, because it infers things that I have power over somebody. I think that at the end of the day, no matter what field you're in, I want to go into the room, not as a woman, I want to go into the room as a competent professional who's respected for what I do. And that to me is first and foremost. And so if it takes, it absolutely takes an inclusive environment to make sure I have every chance that I can get. And I agree with you, Caroline, that cannot just be created from the top. And I think that's what the problem has been. The accountability has been at the top of companies or anything to make the change, as opposed to the expectation that this is better for everybody involved, and that, you know, the general population of whatever the entity is that you're involved with, or in our case it's a company, that we believe fundamentally that's going to make a difference. Does everybody yet know? But we need to continue to demonstrate proof points where it really is making that difference. But I understand you completely. I just worry. I've seen quotas, and I've seen what it's done where people were put in jobs because they weren't competent, and then there's a massive backfire. So it has to be both. I think it has to be both.
And last comment, still on quotas, I have issues with it, but I know that in some cases it's been helpful. This being said, it goes back at the beginning of at the beginning of the day, is the authenticity behind, you know, your goal of, you know, being more diverse. So if the leadership truly believes it's going to be good for the business, it's the right thing to do to attract the right talent. So these are profound good reasons, and it shows then after, when you're acting as a leader, it shows that it's for the real reasons, deep down you believe in it. And then it comes naturally. You don't need quotas necessarily, or sponsorship, although it can be helpful in some cases. But yeah, it goes back to the authenticity behind the intent.
And so if the quota is there to be symbolic, that we value this, then maybe it's not a bad thing to get us started, inertia, get us in motion. But then we need to move on from there. One of my favorite definitions of leadership is communicating to people their worth and potential so clearly they come to see it in themselves. I quote Dr. Stephen Covey with that definition of leadership: communicating to people their worth and potential so clearly they come to see it in themselves. And what we know is that men are willing to apply for a job when they have less than the qualifications, but women will not apply for a job unless they feel they have the grand majority of those qualifications. From that perspective, I do believe it's leadership's responsibility to tap people on the shoulder and say, you have the potential for this. Why have you not applied? The other question that comes to my mind based on what you're sharing with us as well, and let me just do a quick survey in the audience. How many of you are honest? Raise your hand if you're honest. Okay, a quicker survey. Raise your hand if you're dishonest. Okay, I've got one guy and maybe a lady over there. So here's the interesting thing about honesty and dishonesty. Honesty is telling the truth. Dishonesty is sitting in a meeting and having an opinion and not sharing your voice. sitting there in silence and not speaking up. So let me ask the question again now. Those of you that are in this audience, how many of you have sat in a meeting, had an opinion, had a thought, and didn't raise your hand? How many of you were dishonest? It's a very different opinion, isn't it? Wow. So what can we do as a collective? How can we make this happen? I think it's time for enough from me asking questions. I want to find out what questions they have for you. Are you willing? They may get mavericky on you. They may get controversial.
That's what we like.
Who has a question for the panel? Thank you.
Hi, thank you for a really interesting discussion. On the concept of sponsorship versus mentorship, a lot of the, some of the backlash that you're hearing about the whole Me Too movement is that men in power are avoiding some of that sponsorship because of how it's perceived and how to handle that. So how would you recommend companies support individuals that want to offer that sponsorship to a woman in their organization?
So maybe I'll start with that. You know, we've had this conversation with many of the senior executive men in the bank because they were immediately afraid to say, okay, if I'm having a one-on-one meeting in a closed-door environment, if I did something unintentionally wrong, would it be perceived to be an issue in that type of thing? And so, you know, what we've done is there's workplace safety and making sure that everybody feels comfortable coming to work and that they have in our company, the places to call and email and how do if there's something going on seriously, that they have every opportunity to report that and we do something with it because we obviously have zero tolerance for that. But I think what we're seeing now is how do we make sure that coaching and feedback continues to happen in a very healthy way and that those conversations are set up by both parties, if I would call it that. So when women are looking for that coaching and feedback, they're setting it up in a way that says, I'd like to hear about these aspects of what of my opportunities or whether behaviors in a meeting or what types of learning should I be doing. So those conversations are business conversations and everybody needs to feel safe in a business conversation and that we need to position them that way and that both parties are approaching it that way so that, and whether it's men or women, you know, men might also feel on occasion where there's a power play by a woman. It can go both ways, maybe not as often, that's for sure. But I think that it's very important that people understand that the importance of that because you're exactly right. The immediate concern is that maybe I shouldn't because it's going to be perceived as that. So we have to set up those conversations appropriately. And then also, you know, for us, we've done the same thing, videos and training. We have mandatory training now to help people understand this is what good looks like and this is what inappropriate looks like so that everybody's clear. And again, because we operate in so many cultures around the world, there's different standards that we have to educate everybody to say this is the Scotiabank standard. And when you're working at Scotiabank, and I don't care what country you're in around the world, this is our expectation for how things work. So I think it's training, communication, transparency, but making sure that we always understand it's a business conversation and that both parties are involved in setting up what they want to talk about very clearly.
I think there's a difference also between formal and informal mentoring and sponsorship where, you know, if you have a formal program with clear outcomes expected and KPIs and you have, you know, your HR team involved, that creates some kind of a safe space where I don't think it's an issue. It's the opposite. In fact, it's creating some kind of a program with a lot of power, I'd say so. But the formal, the informal thing is very important in here.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to kind of one fundamental that I think you talked about, which is, are you creating or are we creating safe environments in our organizations to have the right conversations? And so it's a cultural thing that we have to work on. It's obviously a society thing too, and I think it's really good that we're starting to have these more honest conversations so that we can get to the root of whatever the issues are.
Yeah. Panel slightly to your left.
Thank you for a very interesting conversation. We have said many times in many places that diversity and inclusion is good for business. But when we look at other things that are good for business, like revenue and generation growth and things like that, we reward it through compensation. Are we looking at rewarding diversity and inclusion through compensation?
So I'll take that one. So each of our executives on the operating committee of the bank has part of their targets. They have in a year, they have a leadership objective, and that leadership objective has certain things in it that talk about in some components, depending on the area. It is a gender target. In other cases, it's a leadership pipeline target. In other cases, and that is a component of compensation. So if they fail on that, there would be an impact in terms of compensation. So is it directly tied to, it's a component of leadership, but there is an expectation, and that's the proof point when I was talking about it's not at the center of the house, it's a management accountability, and these accountabilities get pushed out into the organization. Are we all the way there yet? Absolutely not. Do we have work to do? For sure, but it is seen to be a leadership accountability now. Absolutely.
And I would add that too, in our organization, I think it's a leadership accountability. Also, what we haven't been as good at as we could be is how do you stream that through the whole organization? So it's an accountability for me to impact my compensation, maybe the next layer or 2 layers down, but after that, I would say there isn't the same level of discipline around it and accountability around it. So there's more work to do. It's a journey that we're on.
I would say, though, that it's not just the role of corporations to address this. I think it's important, and yes, we know the data. It improves, ultimately, revenue and profitability to have more women in leadership on boards. But I think that there's also a role of government in this, and we are starting to see this more. So Budget 2018 had some significant measures around including more women in the workplace, around trying to catalyze women entrepreneurship. And that is absolutely critical, because the reality is the world is losing trillions of dollars of economic output each year simply because women don't have the same economic opportunities. And we know even in Canada that if we could get more women into the workforce, again, we'll see billions added to GDP. So yes, corporations need to push this, but we also need the hand of government, I think, to create incentives as well.
Panel just a little bit further back.
Thank you to the panel for just a fascinating hearing the different elements that you bring to this discussion. Heather Wade-Trabulsi from Sun Life. I've got a question that we're talking about language. To me, language has been, it's a huge part of every single part of our life, whether that be in our roles at work, our roles at home, our roles in social life. And I still find it amazing that in the year 2018, almost daily, I am bringing forward and putting on the table, if you say man hours, that means all the women on our team don't have to do anything. And we get the laugh, and it's great, and then I have to say the same thing tomorrow. And I do firmly believe that that is part of our unrecognized biases, that we have a lot in our language that we actually promote exclusion. What are some key things or key tools that each of you could give us that we can deal with bringing the inclusion in our language on a daily basis?
Well, I'll start, and then people can chime in. I think having the right conversations is where I would start, and when I think of it maybe 10, 12 years ago, I was afraid to be in a group of women, etc., where I might say the wrong thing and be kind of do the wrong thing. And I think you learn by feeling it's a safe environment, and if I make a mistake or I don't quite get my point across in the right way, people come up and they'll talk to me and we'll have a conversation, and I won't make the mistake. I won't make the mistake again. So I think you're right. There's a lot in language. We perpetuate stuff through that. I think the only way that we can deal with that is be willing to have the conversations and also call out, like you talked about, the bad behavior, if that's the way to put it, and be willing to do that. And I think sometimes that's hard for people, and it comes back to kind of the honest versus dishonest conversation. When you see some of that stuff, are you going to take the initiative and be the bold person in the room that calls it out to help everybody in that whole room?
Yeah, I think, that transparency, I think Bill's, I go right back to what Bill was saying too around that dishonesty and honesty. And sometimes it's easy to say and harder to do because you're in a work environment where you don't feel comfortable in that meeting calling out that behavior or that language specifically that is offensive. And I think it's only going to go up as we recognize differences around sexuality, gender orientation, things where people will want to be described in a certain way. For us as every individual to have that catalog of this person I describe this way and this person I got to make sure, we will continue to stumble. We won't get it perfect as individuals. And so it's very important for us to speak up about how we like to be, the words that we like to be used, and to remind in a meeting or a discussion that that's what we like. That's, I think, where we're going to have to get to, because the language is going to get more specific about different groups of individuals and how they like to be described. General terms like man hours and things like that, I sympathize with you, because that's language that is really, really old and needs to be completely out. And I think those ones call out in the meeting. Just keep calling them out so that people understand. And if more people call them out, then it'll be used less often, because it isn't the popular way. And I think it is the language of a generation, I have to say. We have huge digital operations now on the bank, and we make a joke where, did you ever think on our executive floors on the 7th floor, did you ever think you'd see a guy in a hoodie and a skateboard and running shoes? And that's an aspect of diversity, the thought that comes from people from completely different industries now into our industry. It's fascinating how different that is, and it's a whole other aspect of diversity that we haven't talked about here, but it's really, and that language is not in that generation, certainly, or in that industry. So how do we start? I think just being more transparent is what we have to do. Rules and regs aren't going to solve that one, that's for sure.
Plan does a lot of work helping governments change even some of their language and their policies and some of their approaches. I would say the two key criteria that we look at are, is language holding power? Are there power dynamics coming out of that in that language that are unfair? So for instance, man hours means that women hours are not as equal. And the other piece is value. And there's a lot of language that we use that sort of infers value to one group over another. And it's not just between men and women, it's between all kinds of diversity, as Barb was saying. So I think look for those two things. What are we unconsciously inferring in terms of power and in terms of value with our language that's unfair?
I will run, because panel, you have been dynamic. I asked you to be also controversial. You were that. And our time is up. I cannot believe how fast that hour went by. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming and thanking our panel.